Our scripture reading, our gospel reading this morning comes to us from Luke chapter 2. Listen now, friends, for the word of the Lord. The child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. Now every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. Then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." He said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth. It was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Before I begin, I just want to say that today's message is in keeping with this church's long-standing commitment to creation care, loving and nurturing that which God made and has given to us. And that certainly does go along with the message today. We are once again an Earth Care congregation, and there will be exciting news to come that is related to that in coming weeks. So I just wanted to lift that up, that joy to you all. But there's a phrase I think is true, and I said something like this in the sermon last week. Maybe you heard it, but you know that phrase, "I know just enough about this to be dangerous"? Maybe you've been there from time to time. I certainly have. A little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing. When we moved into the house that we're in now, it was such a blessing. A family of 5, it was great. Our house now is a little bit bigger than where we were living before. That is wonderful. And it turns out that the previous homeowner was super handy as well, which is great because we're still finding things that he fixed or added to or tweaked or changed, little things that he added to the house. When we moved in, it had like a smart thermostat. How cool is that, right? And but one of the things that he did was he built a deck on the back of the house, and for that he had a gas line attached from the house, so that you could hook up your gas grill, right? So we moved in, and of course, all the things going on, there were lots of things going on in the world at the time too, and so a little frantic, a little harried, I didn't get to hooking up the grill right away, but later on, when I was ready to do that, I think of myself as reasonably handy, probably able to hook up a gas line to a grill. And I looked at the fitting at the end of the gas line and the fitting on my grill, and they really didn't match. And so I was thinking, well, that's okay. I can go find the right parts to hook them up. I can do this, right? It's not that complicated. I looked at the size of the fittings. I looked at how they were situated, what I needed. So I went to the store, and everywhere I went, I couldn't find them. Even looked online, and I'm like, why can't I hook up my natural gas line to my propane gas grill? And of course, I never asked anybody for help, because why would you do that? So finally, one day, I'm looking at the hardware store, and one of the employees walks up to me and goes, "What are you trying to do?" And I told him. He said, "What are you trying to do?" Finally, when he explained to me something I already knew, which is that natural gas isn't the same thing as propane gas, and the light came on, right? He told me, "You could have set your house on fire or blown it up." Yeah, a little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing. There's a good reason those fittings didn't match. Thank the Lord for that. But you see, a little bit of knowledge, yeah. Especially if it's uncoupled with wisdom. Uncoupled with the wisdom, right, to seek help sooner when something doesn't work the way you think it's supposed to. That can be dangerous. Yeah, knowledge without wisdom can be a danger for sure. And I think it's also true, and it's related to that, right? That idea that just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. But I'm going to say more about that in a little bit. We've been talking about wisdom this month because we want to start off this new year thinking about being wiser people. At least I do. I hope for that, for us, for myself, for us, and for the world. And Luke wants us to see that Jesus is wise and growing wiser. You see how our story is bookended by that thought that Jesus in verse 40 is filled with wisdom, even as a small child. And then years later, as a 12-year-old, we see in verse 52 that he's increasing in wisdom. The NRSV actually only has the word wisdom in Luke 4 times. That's 2 of them right there. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. And so we see wisdom in Jesus in the Gospels. Wisdom is born from a great knowledge of the Lord, that knowledge that he showcases to the teachers in the temple. But wisdom is beyond knowledge, right? It seeks the best possible outcome for all. It finds joy when things are well and good. And in the sign and the faith, right, that things will be well and good. Now, going back to the beginning that Melissa read for us, the beginning in Genesis chapter 1, right? Things are good. Things were good. Very good. And God sees these good things that God is making, and in God's wisdom, God is glad in it. In verse 25, we have the creation of the land animals, right? And God saw that it was good. And God saw that it was good is a refrain we're going to hear in Genesis chapter 1 5 times. After God makes the earth and the seas, God saw that it was good. After creating vegetation, after making day and night, after filling the ocean with sea creatures, after breathing life, right, into the animal, creating animals on land, every time God saw that it was good. And then after creating humans, and at the end of that 6th day, God looks over everything, and indeed, it was very good. Creation is so very good. And then, of course, we know what happened 2 chapters later. It didn't take long, did it? The very species that God gave dominion over the other living creatures sinned by eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of knowledge, do you hear that? Knowledge is not the same thing as wisdom. It's just not. And with the knowledge of the difference between good and evil, we humans have been chasing the wisdom with what to do with that ever since. In the Old Testament tradition of wisdom literature, which includes the Proverbs, we have Proverbs 4, verse 7, which says the beginning of wisdom is this. Are you ready? Get wisdom. And whatever else you get insight. Get wisdom. Seek it. Look for it. Ponder it. Get wisdom. Whatever else you acquire wisdom. Wisdom leads to life. It leads to the life affirming for us, for those around us, for all living things, for creation. And so when Luke tells us that Jesus is wise and getting wiser, that's the background. That's the common understanding of what wisdom was and is. And we can hear that in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount or his sermon on the Plain, depending on which gospel you're reading. We can wrestle with that wisdom in the parables that he teaches. We see that wisdom embodied in the way that he treats people. When Jesus enters his public ministry, he encounters people who are already ready for that wisdom, although they wrestle with what it means. But he also finds some who seem set against it from the start. It's interesting to note that, the disciples maybe relatively had less knowledge than the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees, but they were more ready to receive the wisdom that he taught them. Now, please, don't get me wrong. Knowledge is good, and the pursuit of knowledge is good. I'm not saying anything contrary to that. But knowledge without wisdom can end up leading us to dangerous places. It can take us down paths of accumulating wealth and power, right, and privilege for their own sakes. Technology, which is applied knowledge, right, it leads to these great tools for the betterment of society. Tools that we see every day used well, but that we have also seen, have we not, used for great harm, evil, and destruction. Knowledge and technology give us tools, but wisdom teaches us how and when and if to use them. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. And the young Jesus was wise and getting wiser, and the beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom. Seek it, work for it. Before other things, get wisdom. Now, this was some years ago when this happened. Our eldest daughter is 19. This happened when she was in kindergarten, so this will tell you it took place a little while back. But I went to pick her up from school one day, and the intersection in front of her school is just not large enough for the amount of traffic going in, especially at pickup times. And so I was at the intersection waiting to be able to turn left into the school, and there was a line of traffic behind me trying to go straight. So I creeped over and eased further into the intersection so that line of cars could go by. And shortly after that, a police officer got out of his car and walked over to mine. And I rolled down my window and he said, "Sir, I'm going to need you to get out of my intersection." I'm not lifting myself up as a paragon of wisdom here today. But I did have enough restraint to not explain to him why I had pulled into the intersection. Nor did I quote the psalm that says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it." But the passage occurred to me. And I get what he's saying. He was taking responsibility. He was taking ownership for the situation. And I respect that. I do. But it's raised up for me questions of ownership ever since. What does it mean to own something, particularly to own something that doesn't really technically belong to you? What do we mean when we say, "I owned this," or I own this situation, right? Or I own somebody, right? That phrase in Genesis chapter 1 that we have, our NRSV translates as dominion, is that kind of a question. God created humankind in God's image and gave us dominion over the rest of the living beings. What does that mean? There's one theologian that I read recently put it Dominion, is not the same thing as domination. In fact, if we look at how God has dominion over creation and over us, it's really illuminating. God exercises God's dominion over creation and over humanity by loving us, by taking joy in us and it, by sacrificing for us. That's what godly dominion looks like. Is that the way we humans have exercised dominion over the rest of creation? And I get dominion may be a difficult word for us. Maybe it's had different meanings over the years, and that's not something we really relate to or like. So maybe we can think about it just as having loving eyes versus having arrogant eyes. God has loving eyes for God's creation, right? Whereas dominion would be like having an arrogant eye. That would be cruel and selfish and crushing and life-taking and totally disregarding. Whereas God's loving eye is life-affirming, and like wisdom, it's what we're called to have. So how come it is that we, the species, right, that in Genesis 3 brought sin into the world, continue to think that we're superior to the rest of the creatures? When Jesus says even the rocks would cry out in worship of him, why do we immediately assume that's a metaphor? Maybe in circumstances when we humans are too foolish to bow and worship to the Lord, the rest of creation is already there. Why do we think so little of the rocks that we break and sell as minerals, the trees we clear out and burn down to make roads and stores and neighborhoods, the brute and dumb animals that roam the earth or at least stand around in our factory farms? What have we done? All too often with an arrogant eye. We've looked at other people. We've looked at God's creation in terms of what it can do for us, rather than taking joy in what God delights in, what God has made and called good. That arrogant eye, that self-centeredness, that short-sightedness, it's not born from wisdom. We know that. Just as we know dominion is not the same thing as domination. Just because we can do something, yeah, you know the rest. And so I'm struggling with that wisdom, right? How do we respond to this? There are things we can do, practical things we can do, and the church is doing and encouraging others to do, yes. But I want to return back to that thought that the beginning of wisdom is get wisdom. Jesus is wisdom. He embodies wisdom just as he embodies love and sacrifice and concern for all humans and all life. So how do we find and live in that kind of wisdom? I'd like us to wrestle with some questions. How do we want to take ownership of our own hearts, our own minds, our own bodies, and our own messy lives? How do we want to look over that given to us by God with loving eyes, such as the people closest to us, the creatures in our care, our choices, the various situations that we find ourselves in from day to day? Our vocations, the things that we do to make a life. and the marks that will leave upon this world? How do we want to own those things? And how will we own these things in such a way that don't diminish the value of other people, of all living things, and of that which God has made? We'll continue talking about this in coming weeks. But it's food for thought. Amen.